Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. I'm a little off just now. Our dog, Bendico, who's named after the dog from the novel The Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa, like you needed to know that. Benny's had a bad belly for a few days now, which means he's been waking us up a couple of times a night to go outside and do his thing. This morning was midnight and 2 a.m., and it takes me a while to get back to sleep, so meh. Anyway, on the plus side, we are getting our second doses of COVID-19 vaccines tomorrow afternoon. Us being me and Amy. It's the Pfizer-BioNTech one. It's pronounced BioNTech, by the way, at least according to the CEO. And according to my pals at Pfizer, that's going to put us about 10 days away from immunization. I know the CDC says 14 days, but I've got an in. So after that, I probably still won't go out much, but, I'll do my best to set up some in-person pod sessions with other fully vaccinated guests, and we'll see what that's like. Which reminds me, I need to go check out my audio equipment, which has been sitting in a carrier bag in my storage room literally since March 7th, 2020. So I'm sort of hoping that, squirrels haven't been nesting in it or anything. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do a Guitar Center run at some point soon. Anyway, let's get to the show. My guest this time around is Jesse Sheidlower. This is Jesse's third time on the show. He's one of the best friends I've met through the podcast. We have hit it off. He's introduced me to tons of interesting people. He's been a good person to me over the years. I've recorded countless episodes in his apartment in New York with guests who are either coming in, traveling, whatever, and don't have a place of their own or aren't comfortable having me show up at their homes. Anyway, not being able to get together with Jesse for the past year plus has really sucked. And, we've had occasional emails and actual honest-to-goodness phone calls, which is weird. I was happy to learn that he also has a project out that warrants a new podcast, and that would be the recently launched Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction, of which Jesse is the editor. The dictionary is this really fun, illuminating, and useful online resource that tracks the uses of key science fiction terms. Now, Jesse's a former editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and the author/editor of the F Word, a historical dictionary of the word fuck. And we talk a lot about this historical dictionary of SF in the episode, so I'm not going to tell you too much about it and all the neat stuff that I discovered on it in the first week or so that I played with it. I will just say science fiction was a big part of my upbringing as a reader. And I've returned to it, especially in recent years through the show, as I've gone to places like ReaderCon and sat down with SF writers and others, and kind of rediscovered a lot of interesting things about the genre, not just in the escapist, reminding me of my childhood way, but how much the work resonates over the years. And this project, it carries that along. It's a fantastic way to show not just how the words and ideas of science fiction have sort of permeated into the real world and culture, but also how far back those roots can go. The citations you'll find in it are wonderful, and they'll probably start sending you on to check out other authors and people you may have read when you were young and want to get back to, or someone you didn't know about, and holy crap, that seems interesting. I can't believe this person thought of this topic, 70 years ago instead of, well, I thought it was from my childhood. Anyway, go check out the Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction, which is at sfdictionary.com, and start exploring. Now, here's Jesse's abbreviated bio from his Twitter account. He's got a more extensive one at his site, which is jessesword.com. Lexicographer and threesome toll booth manager, sfdictionary.com, adjunct at Columbia, past president, American Dialect Society, XOED, the F word, barbells, Perl, Python. If you know what all those terms mean or how they all come together, you understand more of Jesse and why he's such an interesting person. And now, the 2021 Virtual Memories conversation with Jesse Sheidlower. So tell me about the origins of the historical dictionary of science fiction, where it began and what it's evolved into.
So the Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction started off as a project for the Oxford English Dictionary. So this was in the year 2000 when not everyone was online and not all materials ever published had come online. So there were a few things that we were doing. So the OED has always been a crowdsourced effort. In fact, it's been called the first crowdsourced work of scholarship in the 1870s or so, when 1860s and 1870s, when the work was beginning for the OED. The editors put advertisements in literary magazines asking for people who wanted to help, and people would be sent books to read, and they would read books and fill out slips of paper and send these in to the offices, and these would be filed by the editor's children at a rate of so many pence per day and so forth, and a lot of the initial research was done by this method, and with certain allowances for technology, things still do work this way to an extent. So people do still send in material. It comes in digital form now rather than on slips of paper. But people do read things. Volunteers or just random people will read things and send in contributions to the OED. So one of the things that we wanted to do at the time was use the ability to have things online, to have people contributing over the internet, and to show people the kind of things we were looking for. So we thought of, there were a few different projects we were considering. We wanted to look at something that was narrow in scope, and something where people really could contribute in a way that was hard to do any other way. And science fiction was a very useful test subject for this for quite a number of reasons. One is that science fiction fans were more familiar with being on the internet, and using computers was generally not as complicated a thing. And again, this was people hadn't been on the internet for that long at this point. Things weren't as robust as they are now. One thing is that science fiction is, relatively speaking, limited in scope. That is, where to find science fiction. What is published as science fiction is where science fiction terms will appear. It's not like something like sports or politics where you can find it absolutely anywhere. Science fiction, there's one of the famous definitions of science fiction is what is published as science fiction.
Yeah.
And that's, that, of course, it's an exaggeration like so many things, but for the purpose of this project, it's largely true. So you're not going to be randomly looking, having to look at every possible subject ever to find science fiction terms. And the last important thing for this was that there's a copyright hole from after 1923 for the middle of the 20th century where things published in this era could not easily be put online. So if we were interested in 19th century American, mainstream writing, well, that even in 2000, like a lot of newspapers were digitized. The big newspapers were digitized. The literary works from the 19th century were digitized. More recent things, you had projects to put them online, and again, modern newspapers. But for the 20th century, there was a big hole there, and science fiction was a part of this hole. That is, we couldn't just look things up in databases and get answers that way. The only way to do it was by reading science fiction directly. And one additional important reason, that I forgot, is that because of the way research libraries work, science fiction, especially the initial publications in pulps, in pulp magazines, this sort of thing wasn't included in mainstream libraries.
Sure.
You can't find this. Libraries just didn't collect it because it wasn't considered important. It's like popular culture. To this day, libraries aren't, in many cases, aren't as good as they could be about that. Where a local library might have crappy pulp novels, but the New York Public Library won't, or University Library won't. So even if we knew that a particular story was first published in some issue of Astounding or Galaxy or whatever, you couldn't just go to the Library of Congress and look it up. This is the kind of thing where the materials are collected by science fiction fans, and they're the ones who held it. So those are a bunch of reasons why science fiction was a great way to start this project. And we set up a website. We first just automatically pulled everything with a science fiction label in the OED, and then looked up a whole bunch of other terms that were in the OED, and then entered terms that were not yet in the OED, and just put these all online and said, here's what we're looking for. The earliest we have for this is 1956. And had a list of hundreds and eventually over 1,000 terms that people would look at and would send in examples. And this project ran for a number of years and was very successful. I mean, many people contributed. There were prominent science fiction authors that sent in either comments or criticism, or I used this in this story, things like that. And the site was always updated. It was run by moderators. I set everything up, but it was on a day-to-day basis. It was run by moderators, and people would send things in, and these would get keyboarded and entered into the OED database, and we would update the site. So it would always say, well, now we previously needed something from 1956, and now someone found something from 1944, so anything earlier than that. Site ran for a number of years. Jeff Pruker, one of the moderators, produced a book called Brave New Words in 2007, based on the site, which won the Hugo Award, one of the major science fiction awards, in 2008. Hundreds upon hundreds of new words and antedatings made it into the Oxford English Dictionary based on the site. And eventually the site started, it sort of wound down. I mean, it had been running for about 10 years or so. And the book came out, gave the sense that we had done what we needed to. One of the moderators died, unfortunately. So, contributions were beginning to dwindle. The internet was a much bigger place. It was less interesting to see as it may have been before. And eventually I left the Oxford English Dictionary in 2013, and that severed my access. So the site had always been running on my personal server, and when I left the OED, that severed my access to the OED's databases, and that meant effectively I couldn't update it. So everything was moribund for a while, and that was that. But I'd always thought, this is a useful site. I mean, there's still a lot of useful material here. It wasn't arranged very well. I mean, the design hadn't changed since we first set it up. There was the site was, as it was originally planned, it was set up for people who wanted to send in contributions to the OED. It wasn't meant to be an interesting site to read that if you just came across it, you would find it interesting. Yeah. There's a lot of information. The core information when you looked at an entry was, here's what we have, here's what we need, here's the names of everyone who sent in examples. That's what was highlighted. The definitions were extremely sketchy. They weren't even real definitions. It was just like, here's what we mean. Here's the sense we're looking for. They weren't. And there were eventually, not at the start, but eventually we linked quotations to the site so that the examples that people had sent in were visible. But these weren't edited. These were just like everything pulled from the database. So things were in the wrong place. There were many things that didn't belong there. So there were a lot of ways this could be cleaned up to turn it into something that would be more interesting. And there was a lot of useful information there. And I thought for years, well, this would be good if we could get more moderators, if we could do this again. It would be worth getting going again. And I didn't do anything because I didn't have time, and I would have required reaching out to the OED and finding moderators and all this, and I just didn't have the ability to handle that then. But about a year and a half ago, I started thinking about it again. We could do this. I mean, this is a useful project. There's a lot more happening now. There are, science fiction is growing in different ways. Reaching out to different branches would be a good thing. And about a year ago, one very big change was the start of the pandemic, and there were the I don't want to say advantage, but one benefit of that is that I wasn't going out anymore. I had a lot of time.
We use upshot as opposed to benefit or anything. One upshot of it all was
So I'm home all the time. I'm not going out. I don't have anywhere to be, and I had a lot of time to work on it. So I reached out formally to the OED and expressed my interest in getting it going again, and we talked about how this could possibly work, and I got permission to do that, and I reprogrammed the site. I took the database stuff that existed. I mean, it was in static form, but I turned that into a separate database that was no longer connected to the OED. Which means that updates I have to send in manually. It's not automatically fed in there anymore. But that's the only practical way at this point. Added additional features. I mean, again, highlighted the things that we wanted to highlight, minimized the things that were not the first thing you want to look at, and basically turned it from a here's how to help us site into an actual dictionary, a historical dictionary based on quotations.
What was the most surprising discovery? Like as you've, either the earliest something turned out to show up, or something that, wow, I really thought this term was around a lot longer than it turned out to be.
Sorry, this is going to be hard. I don't have many specific examples offhand. Maybe
what surprised you about the project in general then?
Well, one of the two things that worked out very well for being able to do this project, one was my just having a lot of time to work on it myself. The other thing was the existence of the Internet Archive, which had been around in various forms. Even when we started, the Wayback Machine was around even when we started the project. But the Internet Archive has been adding an enormous amount of material, and one of the things that they've been adding over time is a tremendous collection of science fiction pulps, and many other pulps for that matter. But at this point, the collection, the Pulp magazine collection, is so extensive that it contains pretty much every major pulp that was ever published, that was published in the 20th century. So, an effectively, complete run of Astounding, complete run of Amazing Stories, Planet Stories, Thrilling Wonder Stories, Asimov's Science Fiction, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, like all of the big magazines are digitized in the Internet Archive, so you can search them all. And as I said earlier, the fact that science fiction is, for the most part, what is published as science fiction means that, almost literally, all science fiction published in the 20th century is online searchable. Which, again, like at the start, this is the exact reason why it had to be manual, and now because of this, it's the exact reason why it didn't have to be manual. Why anyone could do it. Why you could research it this way, and that made such an enormous difference. And the amount we learned from it, not only are you knowing pretty much that you're going to find the earliest example, you can find the earliest example of almost anything, and you can also see pretty clearly. How things are spreading, because you would see something used by a famous author, and then a year or two later someone else would use that, and then other people would use it, and it would spread that way, and you can see exactly how that's happening. And sometimes even in the letter columns, many of these magazines have, especially like in the 30s and 40s, had very active letter columns, and science fiction fandom, which is a sort of separate category that we have on the site. Like fans would be writing it all the time and making comments about particular stories, and this was good and this was terrible and you need more things like this, and the art didn't work at all, and you can follow there when people are excited about things. And being able to follow things that closely was an amazing benefit. And but also the existence of all of this material means that it's possible to be very comprehensive in a way that could never have been done before.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've found interesting. The more, I've gone to SF things like ReaderCon over the last bunch of years, doing the show. I'll say the continuity of history within the SF world, where you can still meet people who knew the guy who was edited by Gernsback. You know, you can go all the way back to the 20s, et cetera, with people who, you know, have this sort of living memory. And that sense of, like I say, continuity of people who were there when these things were being discovered or you know, described for the first time or named however well, I don't know what the appropriate term would be, which is, I guess, the whole point of understanding the appropriate term.
But in fact, there are also major projects in fan history going on right now. So fanac.org, which is a major collection of, a tremendous amount of different things related to science fiction fandom, including fanzines, which are, you know, even rarer, even harder to find than any of the than the pulps themselves. There were so many, and going back such a long time. And you know, there are a few libraries that have collections of fanzines, and I've had to use a couple of them on occasion where I couldn't find things anywhere else. Fanac has a lot of them. The search interface could be better, but they have a tremendous amount of things. You can look those up. And Fancyclopedia, which was a dictionary of originally. I mean, it was a dictionary of fan language, originally published in 1944, and then a later edition in 1959, and now there's an online edition which maintains links to the earlier ones and constantly updates this and draws these exact parallels. Like, you know, this fan was known for this and coined this term, and went to all these cons and again, there's a separate subject category on the site for fan terms, which are in many ways they're very distinct from the terms used in science fiction itself. So that's a separate thing, and being able to research those is a useful thing. And people who are specifically interested in fandom have written in with comments and corrections and things that I was missing, or I misunderstood the precise distinction between a couple of terms for types of fans. I
was going to say they can be very punctilious about these things.
They are. They're very, they're very, very specific, and you completely missed this, you idiot. And like, okay, you're right. You know, they were right. I misunderstood it, and now we hope things are better. So,
yeah, it's interesting that the 20-year history of this project, in a sense, mirrors the development of the internet itself, and in a similar sense, you're also capturing the ways in which things that were perceived to be ephemeral turn out to be, long lasting or have importance that, institutions didn't want to cop to once upon a time.
Yes. And this kind of thing, you see this all the time with language. I mean, there's a belief, which has never been true, but, a belief that the OED is concerned only with literary language, or that it's formal or anything like that. And it's true that when things started, because of its nature, edited largely by and for Victorian gentlemen, there were things that it didn't do as good a job on. But nonetheless, the intention was always there to include all language, and to include common speech, and to include the language of agricultural laborers, and to include technical terms from any field. Like, this was always part of the remit of OED. But one of the things that we're seeing now, that in some way, some of this could always have been possible, but the more research that's being done by historians and other, a variety of different scholars, making texts available that were not very available, it turns out that in places where you wouldn't expect to find things, you find very, very major, you get these major discoveries. So there was a project going on while I was there, looking at collections of like household inventories. So, all these, these aristocratic houses, somewhere there are these record books that, today we bought, 3 pigs from so-and-so, and these went to the kitchen, and then we, ordered, this fabric from France, and going on, for centuries long, with costs and this and who ordered it. And like, this is incredibly interesting for historians. But it turns out it's super interesting for historians of language too, because you would find that names for household items that you would have, like the earliest example we had was from the 1730s, and it turns out there's some example from 1530 in some in some aristocratic household that we got this kind of coal coal bin, whatever, whatever it is. It turns out that, of course, people use these terms for hundreds of years before they ended up in a novel.
Yeah, it's fascinating in terms, again, of what was perceived as ephemeral or valueless along those terms. What surprises a lexicographer? Not necessarily related to the SF dictionary, but what are those moments that you have that are just, holy crap, I did not think X was connected to Y, or, what's sort of the nature of surprises within the field?
I think, well, dating examples, the dates that you find are, I want to say, they're always surprising. In some ways, they're never surprising, but after you've done it for a while, you realize that by the time you've heard of something, it's probably been around a lot longer than you think. But being exposed to that over and over and over, even when you know that it's going to happen, is always a little bit of a surprise. And this is especially true with slang, where there's a belief that slang is extremely ephemeral and it's always new. By the time you've heard of something, it's already fallen out of use. You're old and
on fleek.
Yeah. I mean, there are that's something that was coined at a particular time and lasted a short amount of time and went away. But many, many, many things. By the time you've heard of it, it's been around for decades. Like terms for different kinds of coal bins. Let's say, but for slang as well. I guess it's good to see, but it's not that surprising, perhaps, that names of household objects might be older than you think. But it is surprising when you learn that various slang terms that feel very, very new are in fact decades older than you think.
And since the dictionary is launched, what are people looking up? Are you seeing stats on what terms tend to draw the most attention?
I am, and so far there's nothing terribly unexpected about that. People look at a wide range of terms. I haven't been able to get a great sense yet of where people are going in any specific way. I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to learn more about. So the original version had 3 completely separate categories. There was science fiction in general, that is, terms used in science fiction writing. There was fandom, as discussed, for terms used of or about in or about science fiction fandom, and there was science fiction criticism, which generally consists of genre terms, names for tropes, descriptions of things, things like that. And on the original site, these were completely separate. They were separate pages. The idea being, again, this is designed for people who are using it for research purposes. That the people who are interested in fandom terms, that's what they wanted to see. Those were separate. They didn't need to look at anything else. Now they're all combined. There's one alphabetical list. And these are separate subject categories, but there are a number of other subject categories. So there's propulsion and names for spaceships and weaponry and names for names connected to aliens and so forth. A bunch of categories like that, and things related to specific shows that are prominent. So there's Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who have their own categories, and that's something I would very much like to expand. And in fact, I would like the site to, and this will take someone other than me, to take it into, or help take it into different directions, where, let's say, terms from comics related terms, which are not, I mean, we have some comics stuff there, but it's not really well handled, or gaming, which is not really handled at all. There is scope for adding things like that. And I would like to get a better sense of what subjects are interesting to people, what times people click on these links and see what the related terms are, because,
to get an idea of what the user experience or the user expectations are. Yeah, that would be interesting. Do you find people tend to be looking up authors or following, sort of author routes instead of terms? Because that's the rabbit hole I fell into right away. So.
Right. Well, that was another big change on the site. So one of the there are all sorts of really great projects out there for people who are obsessive about things. And one of the things I think is important about the internet is the ability to link projects together. And this has always been a goal of some people. Like, well, if you're let's link everything to this other project. So if we're doing research in Shakespeare, well, this library has a collection of Shakespeare stuff, and we can, and here's Shakespeare commentary, like all this stuff can be linked together. So there's been a project going on for 25 years now called the ISFDB, the Internet Speculative Fiction Database, which is a preposterously comprehensive database of science fiction, including detailed author information, publishing information, where like a story that was published, but if you have some story by a very prominent author, Isaac Asimov, let's say, Arthur C. Clarke, that was published in, this magazine in, 1942, well, it was then collected in some book, and then the book, the story was republished here and the story republished there. And the ISFDB has just extremely comprehensive details about all of this. And it's an amazing project. Even the database itself has been used as an example for books about database programming, for how to set these things up. And one of the things I did at the start of my revamping of the project was to add links to the ISFDB records for authors and publications. So now that's in fact the organizing principle for my site, where originally it was just the text name of the author, which itself was kind of problematic because authors would publish things under different pseudonyms. So rather than my having to deal with it, the ISFDB does this. So I add an author record for everything. And it's very interesting to see this. So you can see all the quotes from any author, and you can look at this in different ways. So so from any entry, and this is linked internally. So the publications are not. So if you look up a particular publication, you'll just go to the ISFDB. If you look at an author, though, you look at the author entry for the science fiction dictionary itself. If you look at Ray Bradbury, let's say, you'll see all the quotes that we have from Ray Bradbury. Yeah. You can resort everything, so you can see things that they have coined. That is, and I use the term coined. Lexicographers don't like to say coined because usually the earliest example you have is just the earliest example you have, and the assumption that it's used in speech beforehand. With science fiction, there in many cases it is more likely that these are coined by someone that so and so is the first person to use this term for this type of space drive or whatever. But either way, you can sort it by the first example. So the authors with the most first examples of things, you can see that. Excuse me. And a lot of people are really interested in that. And each of those, like the author pages, links out to the Wikipedia page and the ISFDB page. So if you're interested in an author, you can, that is a good rabbit hole. You can see all the examples that we have from that author. And, in some cases, of course, because like this is, the dictionary itself is an edited product. Like the fact that there are a lot of quotes from someone doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most important. It could just be that we've read a lot of them. But it does provide something of like the kind of things we're looking for when we're collecting examples.
What do you see as the challenges for keeping it going forward? Either in terms of expansion, in terms of going deeper into the past. Where do you see it? What do you see the challenges for it?
Well, the biggest challenge, as always, is just time. This does take a lot of my time, and continuing to do the work is time consuming. In terms of research into the past, for much of it, we're in pretty good shape because if it was published in Pulps and it's in the Internet Archive, we can get there. So there have been cases where there's a term that a new term that someone suggests, and in some cases you can do the entire editing process in an hour. You find the definition is going to be relatively straightforward. You find a half dozen examples from covering a whole time span. You put these all in, and you're done. But the hard thing is going to be keeping up with things. Science fiction, of course, is always changing. More stuff is coming out. There are things that are that were considered more interesting and now are considered less interesting. I mean, everything always grows and changes, and keeping up with that is important and requires someone with more knowledge of modern science fiction than I have. Someone always reading the new stuff and suggesting things, adding new fields, as I mentioned, like gaming, comics, where these anime, these would need to have someone who's more devoted to those areas, who would be able to spend time on it. But on the whole, I mean, I think it's, I'm pleased with where it is now, and I think that there is a good scope for going forward. Like, I don't think at this point it's going to require a complete rewrite or complete re-understanding of how we're doing it for the near future. I think it's on, for what it's trying to do, it's on a pretty good basis,
Awesome.
Pretty good standing.
Now, has the whole process turned you on to other writers or people you want to get back to, or are you just too busy? Have you been too busy just assembling, compiling, and putting it together?
Mostly that, although of course I find an example and find myself rereading a page or so of a story, and then find myself rereading the entire thing. Again, I neglected to mention this before I mentioned the existence of everything in the Internet Archive, but wherever possible, we link to those as well. So if you look at the first example of so-and-so, or any example of so-and-so, and it's from one of those pulps, we'll provide a link to that page. So if you we have a sentence or so on the site, but if you want to go to see the full context, you can just click and you're right there, at a page image of the original thing. So you can read your way through the entire thing. And we have, I originally had a systematic effort, had some volunteers doing bibliographic research on that, just, went through first, like, okay, all of the first examples, we want to look all those up. And everything we add, we're going to put in links for that. And now we're trying to go through and just in passing, whatever we see, like, add links wherever we can. So as much as possible, these are linked to the full versions. And you find yourself, going from one sentence to the whole paragraph, and then all of a sudden you're reading the whole story. But one of the things, an important aspect that we haven't gotten to yet is what things are not in there and why. And that has been something that people have criticized with some validity, but also I think, well, not misunderstanding, but the purpose of a dictionary like this is kind of specific, where we're looking at the core vocabulary of science fiction. We're not looking at any term that has ever been used by anyone in science fiction. And what happens is that the authors who tend to get represented are the more representative authors. If you're writing about the same kinds of things as other people, like time travel or interstellar travel or space warfare, things like that, well, a lot of people are going to be using similar terms for that, and those are the terms that become the main terms in science fiction. Those are the ones that go on. Sure. If you are doing something highly original, those terms might not go on, or probably won't go on if you're the only person using them.
Or they're tied to the universe that you're making. Yeah. If
it's tied to the universe, then they're not going to spread, and they shouldn't spread. So I mentioned before that we have terms from various shows. The goal is not to include every term from Star Wars. There are a lot of terms from Star Wars that even if you've never seen Star Wars, like you know the word lightsaber, you know the word Jedi, but you don't know everything because there's an infinite number of terms. So an example I give on the site itself, talking about the inclusion policy, there's a Wikipedia page that has 60 named alien races, named sentient alien races in the Star Wars universe. Yeah. And this page only covers A through E. There are 5 other pages, however many total, covering, there are hundreds of named sentient races in Star Wars. I'm not saying this is not interesting, but it's interesting only to certain people, and those people can find it somewhere else. Like, where these terms arose. They arose in Star Wars. So I don't need to include them because there's no more information I can give than you can't already find somewhere else. And it's only interesting to people who are interested in something that hyper-focused. So this applies. I mean, that applies. That's something relating to a universe, but this also applies to individual authors, where perversely, perhaps, the more original an author is, the less likely they are to be represented in this dictionary. So people say, well, you don't have terms in, like the term is very white. The dictionary is very white male oriented. You don't have terms from, let's say, N.K. Jemisin. There aren't that many terms from N.K. Jemisin. How come you don't have origin in there? So, well, the answer is she's the only one who uses it. Like, it applies to her universe. She uses it. No one else uses it unless they're talking about, that. And that's a sign that it probably doesn't belong in here. In contrast with something like Ansible, which was coined by Ursula K. Le Guin, but was, picked up by many other writers, very prominent writers. So now, Ansible, that's an instantaneous communication device, not limited by the speed of light. This is, I think, first used in 1966, and now many, many, many science fiction terms by works by many authors use Ansible. So that's a different thing. That's something that spreads, but there are things that don't spread, and it doesn't mean that the authors who use these terms are not good or not important. I mean, if anything, it can be the opposite. Like, there are very prominent authors who are underrepresented. Ray Bradbury is one. Mm-hmm. Ray Bradbury wrote, was a very, very good writer, but wasn't for the most part, using, lots and lots of technical terms. I mean,
that may be why he was such a good writer. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
But I mean, people say, Ray Bradbury wasn't a science fiction writer. He was a writer who wrote science fiction, this kind of thing. But whatever, that's that kind of thing is a separate debate. But very more creative writers, might not be in here, not because they don't, because I don't like them or because I haven't read them, but because they're not core.
Yeah. And the terms, like you said, didn't proliferate and become something that's either an SF standard or infect the real world in some ways.
Right.
Now, tell me about your SF history. What was it like? What did you read when you were young? How much is this project, a sort of labor of love for a younger Jesse?
Surprisingly, not that much. I mean, when I was young, I was very, very interested in science fiction, and I would take the train into the city. I grew up in the suburbs. I took the train into the city to shop at, science fiction bookstores and buy rare things. And I went to a small number of conventions. A few Star Trek conventions, whatever I could get to. And I generally liked like the 1950s stuff. I liked Paul Anderson a lot. I liked the kind of core stuff we're talking about here. I was less. I mean, this is in the 80s, let's say 70s and 80s. I was less interested in the stuff that was coming out then, but I read some of that too. And eventually, I mean, I never really stopped entirely, but I wasn't really a super fan back then either. But I was definitely reading a lot of science fiction. At some point, I just started reading less. And when we started this project, it wasn't because of my own personal interest in science fiction. I never rejected it. I never thought, oh my God, my adolescent foolishness. It was nothing like that. I mean, I still respected it. I just wasn't reading it as much anymore. But the reasons that we started this project were not really connected to my personal affinity for the work. It was just because it was a good subject in various ways. Mm-hmm. And similarly, when I restarted the work, the project, it wasn't because, I miss science fiction, want to get back to it. It was still because, this is still a good subject. We already have a lot of material. I think people will be interested in this. It's good to have it out there.
And that the internet had caught up.
Yeah.
Now, have you been seeing other interesting lexicographical projects arising from people during the pandemic year?
I don't think anything specific. I mean, there continue to be various interesting projects going on, but I don't think there's been anything very specific where someone also said, like, okay, pandemic, we can do.
I'm stuck at home. I'm going to start going into this project, or. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, people are interested in the vocabulary of COVID-19 and things like that, which is itself, kind of interesting. But there's always going to be something like that going on, sure.
Yeah. Oh, I just mean again, I'm stuck at home. I guess this is the time to pick up Project X that I haven't worked on for, 15 years. But yeah, as opposed to me and my strange attempts at self-improvement over the past year, which really I think are I don't know if staving off self-destruction is the same thing as self-improvement, but
Well, I think we're all familiar with that by now. So
yeah. Yeah, I have to say, in the mind map that I keep of where all my guests come from, like who referred me to whom, and they all branch off like that, you're one of the major nodes of this stuff. And a lot of podcasts have come to me from you and from people I've met at the parties that you've held. Have you been planning any sort of like what the return to normalcy party would look like for you?
I've been thinking about it a lot. I haven't been planning yet, but I'm certainly very, very much looking forward to it. I miss it terribly. I mean, we've discussed on the show before the Threesome Toll Booth, my bar. I miss this enormously, and we're still trying to work out when the right time to reopen will be. And it's probably not going to be the spring. It will probably be the fall. I'm very much looking forward to entertaining again. I had COVID last March, that was a year ago, at the very start. So I've felt, and I've been extremely careful, but I've felt somewhat safe seeing, people on an individual basis at home. But finally things are starting to feel a bit more open, I think. And I got together with an academic I know the other week, and her partner, and it's like I think the first time I'd had two people over an entire year, and it was just so great to see them. And I can't wait for all this to get going again. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to have you back down as well.
A refrigerator repairman is literally the only person who has entered our house since, well, I would say even before March of last year, because we're weird people to begin with. But there was a degree I was like, has anyone been inside? And he's like, yeah, that time the freezer had a problem. I'm like, yeah, that's it. There's been nothing else that no one has crossed our door. It's been a bit weird. Well, it's very weird in terms of, what it does to us in terms of socializing, et cetera. One of the things I'd wondered, your wardrobe is something you're well known for. You wear suits to the office. You and I have talked menswear in the past. During the work from home life, did you try to keep up, or were you in the sweatpants and ratty cardigan camp like I've been?
Not ratty, but it's mainly been the sweatpants camp. I did buy an extremely expensive cardigan from a London maker that I like very much.
I did too. I've got one that's not super expensive, but yeah, I bought a really nice one in January for that reason. So
yeah, and similarly, I did buy. I didn't. To be honest, I did not own a pair of sweatpants before. I had certain. I had
standards.
I had things if I'm working out and it's cold outside, I would have whatever, compression tights or whatever, but not sweats as such. And yes, I got a pair of fancy, merino wool, lounge pants, whatever you want to call them. And I pretty much lived in them for, 4 months straight. And there were occasionally one or two times when, a vintage piece came around that I thought, okay, even though I can't wear that, I have to get this. I'll be able to wear it again. But yes, I was not, and I do know people who really have been, wearing, good clothes every day at home for their Zoom meetings. I was not in that category.
Well, I did a virtual conference last December where we did 12 Zoom webinars over 6 business days, and I made a point of having a different suit, tie, and shirt for every single session, even when they were like back to back. If there was a 5-minute break in between, I'd run upstairs, change, and come back down into another one. Not that I had any thought that people were going to notice this, but just so I could start getting them back into rotation a little bit. So, I've actually been bringing my suits down to our local dry cleaner. I've realized after a year without going there, I'm like, I should A, make sure he's still in business. B, if so, just start bringing the suits in, partly to help his business, partly mentally to tell me, Gil, you're going to be wearing these again someday. Let's get them refreshed. Let's take care of them, bag them, and actually be ready for the day we're traveling to a trade show or going somewhere again. But yeah, it's been kind of difficult to imagine. So,
yeah.
With the dictionary, have you been still lambasted by people over the definitions that you've used, or has that settled down somewhat?
It's mostly. I mean, I don't think there was ever too much criticism. I mean, there have been.
People always have something to complain about. It's the internet, but
sure. There have been some corrections, but it hasn't been too hostile. I'm happy to say, and most of the corrections have been in the well, you missed this, or this should be better, rather than you're an idiot category, and I'm glad to see that. Of course, I mean, no one wants to be criticized, and of course, I know myself. Like when the original plan for this was that it was going to be very much a work in progress. It was going to be very incomplete, and I was worried about that. But as time went on, I realized actually this is this is fairly complete. Like there aren't that many things that are totally unfinished or in a really bad state, and I made a big effort to polish, at least the exterior, so that it wasn't obviously a completely unfinished entry or things. So when it launched, it did feel like a fairly complete thing that was being added to, rather than a massive pile of unfinished stuff. And I think things might have been different if it had been more obviously raw when I started.
And do you have an actual criteria for when something qualifies in terms of the amount of usage, that this has been used enough that it deserves placement in the dictionary? Or is it sort of much like the definition of science fiction or pornography, you know it when you see it?
Right. There's no strict set of characteristics that something has to have. There are a lot of things I look at, including just the raw frequency, how many examples of something there are out there, whether it does seem to be something broadly used or potentially broadly used, whether something has a relation to other terms that are out there, filling a semantic class, as like the OED might say. If there are other, like if there are different parts of speech of something, you might put in, different forms or different parts of speech. Even if individually they might not be important, but together they could be. How easy it is to draft. I mean, to be honest, like if I have something that I can, that I figure I can do in half an hour, I might as well put it in, if it's even if it's a bit marginal. But in fact, there are a lot of things. I mean, there's a separate list of stuff in progress, which is hundreds of items long now. And of those, there are probably, a good number that absolutely could go in. There's also a number that are absolutely never going to go in, I think, just like someone suggested this or encountered it and just wanted to record it somewhere, and it's there, like, this is not going to go in, but we're taking note of it. But there are quite a number that could go in if I had the time. And again, people are suggesting new things all the time. So there's no one thing that will say, okay, if I have 10 examples of this, then it goes in. Yeah. Most of the time you would not want to put in, like if you only had 2 examples of something, of course you wouldn't want to put it in. You'd have to have a really, really good reason for putting something in if it's not being widely used. But this is true for other dictionary projects as well. Depending on the kind of use, you do privilege, even if you're trying to be very, very strict about things, you privilege certain kinds of uses. So if you take, academic terms, especially academic terms from fields that you, the random lexicographer, care about, you'll very often soften the requirements for that. So like a very technical term that's only used in, academic philosophy. Well, if there are 10 examples, from 10 different journals, okay, well, this is a real term in this branch of, this sub-branch of philosophy, I'm going to put it in. Where if you had some, a slang term that you had examples from, like 10 examples on Twitter, you would never put it in. So that's to some extent being like, that's not really right. You should have the exact same criteria for anything. But yeah, so something with a small number of examples where it's being used by recognized critics of science fiction to describe some subgenre might have more sway than something with more examples, but not that interesting.
Sure. Yeah, so it reminds me sort of when I started out in the pharmaceutical world through a business-to-business magazine where I helped launch in 1999, and I thought everyone else knew what all the terms were because of my longstanding imposter syndrome. I thought I was the one person who didn't. And 2 or 3 years in, I discovered, holy crap, nobody knows what all these terms mean. Right. And I started putting together a glossary in the magazine that I was running. And the first time I put it out, and this was, again, 2001, 2002, internet, good, not great for, searching out terms and figuring out, what the accepted definition is versus, what's, strictly or statutorily there. And, I put it into the magazine as like a 16-page feature, and people started asking for PDFs because they wanted to use it for training at their companies, which terrified me because I made up a bunch of the term or the definitions and really didn't feel like this is appropriate for pharmaceutical training. But it grew over the years, and that became a challenge in itself because it was a print analog in addition to being digital. Cutting back certain definitions, adding new terms as they either were invented in our industry or, I discovered them. A lot of things were acronyms that also needed fleshing out. But yeah, it was weirdly rewarding, figuring out all these things, but also just figuring out that nobody had all the answers. That sense of, oh, thank God, it's not just me. I didn't know what this meant. And it turned out nobody else knew what it meant either. Or one company used that term differently than everybody else did. And that was confusing everybody.
Yeah. And this is something you see a lot of if you hang around lexicography long enough, and there will be fields like this, trade groups or whatever, some narrow field where they will decide, well, we needed a glossary. We need to have our own glossary. And how do we do this? And sometimes, some random person will just, well, I'll do this. And then as you've discovered, it's a lot harder than you think. Or sometimes they will hire a lexicographer to do it or help them do it for them. And you'll have something setting out the terms in this area. And it's in fact very hard to do, not least because one of the tensions in dictionary making, I mean, most modern dictionaries are, broadly speaking, descriptive. That is, you say what the way something is used rather than say this is what this should mean. But when you're talking about something like this, where you have a field where there are or it is desired to have widely accepted or understood meanings for terms, that's a little bit different. You can't just say, well, everyone's using this in different ways. You want to say, well, no, this means this, and this is how you should use it. And how to discuss that, and also acknowledge that, well, this company uses it in a different way, or sometimes it's used loosely or whatever. How you say that and how you give advice to the people who are using this glossary is a complicated subject.
Yeah. Well, a few years ago, I had a meeting with FDA and a bunch of the pharma manufacturing, the actual manufacturing guys who I represent. And the FDA wants this set of standard metrics across all manufacturing facilities so they can better understand quality and blah, blah, blah. And they had different metrics they wanted to apply, and we were explaining why some of them don't work. And one of my members finally said, all of this instance about batch records of manufacturing, it really depends on what your definition of a batch is, because I have 5 different companies that are using our services, and each of them has a different definition of batch. And the FDA people in the room just turned white. They were aghast because they had no idea that everybody had these custom tailored definitions based on their existing systems and the sorts of things they were making. And they were just, but can't you all get them to use the same term? We're like, we don't have the leverage here. You're the FDA. You can make them use the same term, but we're just the guys making all the drugs and vaccines for people. So yeah, it can be a challenge, I guess, especially with well, the whole multinational thing, the way different cultures and companies have evolved over their lives, or their spans.
Yeah. Well, and I know various examples where government regulators of various stripes have attempted to make comments on things based on some technical meaning of a term, where that's not necessarily the more widely used thing. Where, like, I know of a company where like some federal agency brought, like, it was making some kind of nature, science or nature toy, and they referred to ceramics and rubber and whatever. It's like, well, no, like, this has a very, very specific meaning. Rubber is only this kind of thing. It's like, yes. Well, no, actually, if you look in the dictionary, it says, ceramic is, this or anything kind of like this in characteristics, or things like that. I mean, in fact, I had this very early in my career. I wrote I don't want to say what the actual term was, but something where I described, wheels of something being made of rubber. And the company said, well, no, they're not rubber. It's actually, poly, whatever, some plastic-like, rubber-like compound. And so, okay, well, the dictionary definition, I mean, sense, whatever sense is, the material made from a sap of this tree, but, the other sense is, anything having characteristics like rubber as being soft, pliable, whatever. Like, that's the definition I'm using here.
Yeah. Just say rubbery. That's
yes.
Yeah, it's always a challenge with this stuff. We're actually working on revamping the glossary into like a 1 or 2 page cheat sheet to give to like congressional staff so that they can understand the terms that we're using, and because it's very easy to misinterpret these things and go drastically off the rails from what we're intending or what we're trying to get across to them. So everything ties back to language, I guess.
Yeah.
Stylish mask. Did you end up, getting anything for pandemia that works in terms of style for your face mask, or did you go with the practical?
Well, both. I mean, in fact, very, very early on, maybe the first mask I got, I have a friend who's a costume designer for theater, and she was out of work right away and spent the first month. I mean, she had a sewing machine. She had she had her studio. So, for the first month or so, she was, hand making masks before, all the big companies were doing it, and Etsy and all that. And I have 2 masks that she made me, one of which is purple. And, as I have purple hair, and purple is one of my main colors. So she made me a purple mask, and another one had a more, elaborate pattern on it. And I still use those. I've gotten a few masks in, from, the, regular designers now, which, fit well for particular purposes. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm usually just picking, just a, disposable black, black mask.
And you've been keeping up with the hair color?
Yes. I mean, of course, that was one of the hard things in the early stages. I mean, my hair starts dark purple, fades to a medium purple, fades to a fuchsia kind of thing, and then starts going, depending on how much light I have and all that, and how long it's been, it will start going through, pink and, blue and white. And it was quite a long time before I was able to get back to my, before my color. And it's something it's very, very hard to do on your own, to be bleached properly. I can't really just do it in my sink. So until I got back to my person, it was really looking kind of a mess. And like everyone, that, being able to get a haircut again was a big thing. And that was a fun thing for me when I was finally able to get back there.
Well, we're at 14 months for me. I posted a picture on Instagram yesterday where I was bending down to take a picture of something, and my phone was in selfie mode, so I just saw this giant blowout of hair and thought, yeah, Bride of Frankenstein. I'll go with this look, and just I had to put that online because you should own the bizarre looks that you've adopted over the course of this year plus, I figure. So
yeah, but that thing. I mean, I went to the dentist this past week for the first time. And I needed to go at the very start of it. I was late for an appointment then, and now starting to take care of these basic things is feeling very good right now.
Is there a place you want to travel to once it's safe to like go somewhere? I know you motorcycle and go upstate sometimes or environs, but somewhere, plane travel that you would want to get to?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't actually travel all that much. I mean, I like going to the British Isles, and I look forward to getting back there again. I don't have some big trip like, oh my God, now that I can travel again, I'm going to go to this, very unusual place. But yeah, I mean, I look forward to getting back. To going on more motorcycle trips. I do look forward to getting back to the British Isles. There are probably, there are people I might want to see. I'd like to see my parents again.
It's overrated.
But no really special thing, specific thing that I'm looking forward to.
As opposed to reopening the threesome toll booth.
Yeah, that's that will be good.
Yeah, I could imagine. And able to read during this whole thing, and if so, what have you been reading?
Barely able to read, no. Which is again huge frustration. I mean, I have all this time and nowhere to go, and I pick up a book and read 3 paragraphs and realize I'm still looking at the first one, and it's been very frustrating. I mean, I have a lot of books, and I keep getting more, and I'm just like they're stacking up. So I have not been keeping up the way I would like. I did just read. As you might know, I'm a big fan of Richard Thompson, musician, and his autobiography is actually, I think it's officially publishing coming out on Tuesday, but I got a copy 2 weeks ago. I read that with great enjoyment. So that was fun, and I know you're a fan of Central European stuff. There was a Bohumil Travel book, not a novel in this case, a sort of a memoir thing that New Directions just published, and I read that over the weekend, and both of these, it felt good just to be sitting down and reading again, which it's been hard to focus on. And of course, while I've been working on the science fiction project, that also sucks up. When you spend all day working on, and this wasn't all day, I still have a day job, but when you spend all day working on language stuff, you come home, you don't really feel like reading hard things.
That's not it's so text driven, what you're doing that, I can imagine it's difficult to get to a different mind.
Yeah. So here I spend the whole day working, my day job, and then, work on science fiction all night and all weekend and whatever. And the time I have afterwards, I wasn't really like, okay, I'm going to pick up something else to read. No, it's like I'm just going to stare vacantly out the window for an hour or so.
Yeah, that's, again, that's life for me at this point too. There's a stretch where if I'm not reading for the show, I find myself thinking I'm surrounded by over 3,000 books here. And yet for some reason, I'm not just picking something up and reading because I'm trying to get away from the flux, I guess. But, we'll get back to it, I'm sure. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to the next party, or the first party. Whatever vegan stew you come up with, I will dress much better than I normally do for your events, just so we can have that sort of roaring 20s, come back to life. And I'll direct people to the dictionary of science fiction and, figure out, for me, it was the nerding out over Douglas Adams references. That was only about 10 or 12 of them, but, still that was my nerd thing. I still have my original copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy here, which I can't actually send a picture of because it's disintegrated. It's just loose pages, but that's what SF meant to us.
Yeah.
So Jess, thanks so much for coming on, and God, I hope we can get together in person soon.
I look forward to that. Gil, thanks for having me on as always.
And that was Jesse Sheidlower. You can find the Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction at sfdictionary.com. And it really is a blast. I think you'll enjoy exploring it if you're the sort of person who enjoys listening to this show. Now, Jesse's site is jessesword.com. Actually, it might be jessesword.com now that I think about it. Anyway, Jesse's Word, JESSE. SWORD. You ought to follow Jesse on Twitter, where he goes as Jesse Sheidlower, which is JESSESHEIDLOWER. And you can find out more about the status of the Threesome Toll Booth at threesometollbooth.com. I'll have links to all of this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. just let them know that there is this neat podcast out there featuring interesting conversations with writers, artists, dictionary editors, and others. You can also help by letting me know what you like and don't like about the show. Send me postcards, letters, emails. You can leave a message on the Google Voice account I set up, which is 973-869-9659. I don't answer that number. I just get incoming voicemails there. The limit is 3 minutes per message. So, however you reach out, tell me what you like and don't like. Tell me who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie, TV show, book, comic, music, piece of art, whatever that you think I should turn listeners on to. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. If you subscribe to my Patreon, stop. I'll still, occasionally send messages or copies of my zine or whatever. But really, if you've got money to spare, help other people. My job treats me just fine. I do dig the validation of people saying, yes, what you do deserves some sort of financial reward, but I don't need that money as much as other people do. So go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, whatever. You can find individuals in need. There are also institutions like your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds. There are a lot of ways that you can help us all work towards a better world. So I hope you help. Also, still have about 30 copies left of the first issue of my first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, #1. If you want one, it's free. Just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up through the form there. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but don't feel obliged. It is not about me making money. It's just me sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.